Given people a couple minutes to join in. Jarrett, would you like to start us off with a bit of an opening?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this town hall event, exploring emerging themes for the District of Central Saanich Official Community Plan Review. My name is Jarrett Matanowicz. I am the Director of Planning and Building Services with the District of Central Saanich. Before we get started, I'd like to invite Mayor Ryan Windsor to welcome everyone. Mayor Windsor?
Thanks, Jarrett. It is common now for council to formally acknowledge that the territory on which the district resides is the traditional territory of the Saanich people. That includes the Sartlip and the Saelt First Nation, who some may know speak the language of Sanchothan, and the district has taken steps to work with Saanich community on Sanchothan place names. I'd like to also acknowledge that members of council may be viewing this either this evening or after the fact, and of course we'll get the feedback from this presentation this evening. So it is critical that our community members participate in this evening, and to help us create the best possible community plan. We're asking everyone to leverage the collective imagination of the community. So I'm excited to hear from the panelists and listen to the Q&A, and I'd like to invite all of you to continue to participate in the official community plan process throughout the process. And back to you, Jarrett.
Thank you, Mayor Windsor. So the purpose of today's event is really fourfold. First, it's to update community members on where we are at in this OCP review and where we're headed. Is to share what we've heard from the community members to date, as we have undertaken some consultation already in this early phase. Is to present thought-provoking ideas from experts from various fields that are joining us today, to help community members be engaged and get excited about the future of our community, as well as to provide an opportunity for community members to ask questions of our expert panel and the rest of the project team. So following the presentations, you'll be able to ask your own questions using our webinar's question and answer feature. You will be able to upvote other attendees' questions as well that resonate with you most, using that feature in the questions and answers feature of this webinar. The button for that is at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be posed throughout the presentation, but will be discussed in an organized way near the end of the evening through a question and answers period with the panel. The event is being recorded and will be posted online to the project webpage in the next couple of days at letstalkcentralsaanich.ca/OCP. We'll try to answer any questions that we aren't able to get to today on the project website as well. So please look there for any discussion that you don't see occur from your questions. We've left the chat feature open for you to leave comments or ask for technical support as we go through this. Please just remind you to be respectful with your comments to our panelists, our staff, and other attendees, as all of our members, we all are members of the community. And certainly we would love to keep the chat feature open during the event. To give some brief introductions, the district is working closely together with the team of consultants led by Modus Planning, Design, and Engagement on this OCP review project. And at this point, I'll pass it over to Rob Bars, who's a principal with Modus.
Great, thanks so much, Jarrett, and thank you, Mayor Windsor, for the introductions. So I'll just give a little wave, everybody, just so you can see who I am. So I'm Rob Bars, and I'm a principal and senior planner with Modus. Modus is the consulting firm that's been hired by Central Saanich to help them with the OCP. And I'm joined by my colleagues today, Edward Porter. Edward, give a wave. So Edward's principal and senior planner with Modus, and he's going to be presenting shortly on urban design and economic development. Also joined by Patrick Ostrick, who's a senior planner with Modus, and Michael Meyer, who's a planner and engagement specialist with Modus. And Michael's been doing a lot of the organizing for tonight, along with Andrea from the district. So thanks to you both. We're also joined by other members of our consulting team. So they're going to be presenting on some of the key topics today. So in order of the presenters, that's Tim Shah. Give a wave, Tim. Tim's senior planner, transportation planner at Watt Consulting Group, and he's going to be speaking to transportation and mobility tonight. Mike Coulthard, give a wave, Mike. He's principal and senior forester and biologist at Diamond Head Consulting, and will be speaking to natural areas and biodiversity within the district. Jessica Shoebridge is the founder and principal at Thrive Consulting, and she's going to be speaking to climate change and resilience. And last but not least will be Ione Smith. Ione is director at Uplands Agricultural Consulting, and we'll be talking to agriculture and the food sector. So you'll hear from the panelists shortly. In the meantime, I'm going to hand it back to Michael, who's going to take you through an introduction to the project.
Thank you, Rob. I'll give a brief introduction to the OCP project at this point. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you may be wondering, what is an official community plan? Well, the OCP is one of Central Saanich's most important documents. It's a framework to help council in its decision-making processes and to help guide our work as district staff. The OCP presents the long-term vision for the community, setting out objectives and policies that guide planning and land use management decisions. It helps us determine how and where we live, work, play, and move throughout our community. So OCPs, they are legislated by the provincial government through the Local Government Act, which sets out what an OCP must include. For example, an official community plan includes an assessment of how much housing is needed and what type of housing in the community to meet that demand for housing in the future. It also must include targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and strategies for achieving those targets. The OCP is a tool for managing change in the community. The OCP sets out land use designations and provides policies on different topic areas and issues that can then be used to evaluate development applications, but also assist in municipal budgeting and strategic planning when we're looking at future directions and projects for the district and the community. An OCP sits within a hierarchy of other regional and municipal policies, plans, bylaws, and works together with these documents to help both regulate land use and set the course for future growth and managing that growth in our community. So why update the official community plan? So our official community plan was adopted in 2008. So to effectively guide our decisions, we want to ensure the OCP reflects our current values and priorities, addresses current and trending issues, and prepares the communities for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. We've also done a lot of great work together as a community since 2008. And many new plans, studies, and best practices have been developed that focus on topics like climate action, neighborhood design and housing, and densification, active transportation, as well as economic development through our Keating business district, for example. We want to ensure that we incorporate that great work into our updated official community plan. And how are we going to do that? Well, we've broken the project into 4 phases, and I'll briefly touch on each of these phases. So we're currently in the second phase, just in case you're wondering that. But in the first phase, we did a lot of pre-planning work, which is essential to helping make this project a success as we move through it. We developed a work plan, developed a strategy for engaging with community members, and conducted background research to understand where we're at in the community on key topic areas. We also formed an official community plan advisory committee consisting of community members. We've reached out and have been in good engagement with our local First Nations. And we've also engaged with some key community stakeholders. So now we're in phase 2, as I said, and we're exploring the current official community plan and identifying its strengths and weaknesses with respect to what our community wants to become in the future. This is the first phase of the broader engagement that we're doing now, and there are several opportunities for community members to get involved that will be active through to mid-April. We will provide some more detail on those engagement activities right now, and I please encourage you to visit our Let's Talk Central Saanich website for the official community plan project webpage. Moving to the third phase, which will occur towards summer and into fall, we'll begin drafting OCP policies and objectives, considering what we've heard from the community to date through this engagement process, as well as background research and technical analysis. And near the end of that phase, there will be opportunities for the community to weigh in again on some of the draft policies that we've developed as we move forward. And finally, in the fourth phase, well, that's making any adjustments we've heard through further engagement to the draft OCP and taking it through the legislative process, the bylaw adoption process of council that's established in the Local Government Act. And now I'll pass it over to our consultant team to take you through the more topic area interesting parts of this presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that project overview, Jarrett, and thanks to you, everyone, for joining us today. As Jarrett mentioned, here is some of what we've already been hearing through stakeholder and public engagement to date. I think it's important to understand how the district intends to incorporate the community's input and feedback into how it makes decisions about the OCP. Insight generated from engagement is one of several important streams of information. This weave diagram shows how we integrate direction from council and district staff, technical planning work, and best practice research, our engagement with First Nations, alongside those insights to create the best possible plan. The diagram shows how these different streams work together over time to move from the general to the specific, finding consensus and agreement by working together. Information and ideas from all of these streams interact, leading to learning, shared insights, and the emergence of new ideas throughout the process. No single input, comment, or activity determines the outcome, and council, as elected decision makers, ultimately reserve the right to decide as they see fit. Just some context for you. So in the first phase of the project, we reached out to and had early meetings with local First Nations. We held stakeholder meetings and met with the OCP Advisory Committee, council, and district staff. The results from engagement with those groups in the first phase helped us shape how we're engaging on specific topics in the current phase of the project. You can see the engagement opportunities that we have underway on this slide. If you haven't already, we strongly encourage you to participate in a community conversation, for example, with your family, friends, and colleagues in a safe way that respects public health guidelines, of course. You can find the community conversation workbook online at letstalkcentralsaanich.ca/OCP. The preliminary results that I'm about to present are from the priorities and character survey, mixed in with some of our earlier engagement in phase 1 as well. So on to priorities. In the survey, we asked about Central Saanich's most urgent priorities today and in the future. It's important to clarify that no topic is going to be left out of the review and update process, but these responses help us understand where we need to focus our attention on any specific areas of interest. Some of the trends that are emerging from these preliminary results show that growth management, agriculture and food security, environmental protection, and parks, trails, and recreation access are high priority topics. We can see that when people think about priorities for today, they lean more towards managing growth, accessing nature and recreation, and supporting local businesses. We can also see that when people think about priorities for the future, they lean towards agriculture and food security, environmental protection, climate and disaster resilience, and supporting an aging population. We also asked about the hopes and concerns that community members have for current and future generations that live in and work in Central Saanich. I think the panel presentations today will be very relevant given the themes that are coming out of the responses to these two questions. These are not in any particular order, but some of the themes that have started to emerge include preparing for and adapting to climate change, the health of the agricultural community and preservation of agricultural lands, the health of local small businesses and having a strong local economy, living in a community where it is safe to walk and ride a bike. And there was a very strong focus on housing affordability as well. And preserving and enhancing Central Saanich's unique community character was a strong theme that came out of our earlier engagement in phase 1 as part of other past projects at the district, and continues to be a strong theme in our engagement in phase 2. As part of our work, we are trying to identify the specific attributes and features that make up rural and small town character in Central Saanich. Getting a better sense of what that means to community members will help us establish a common definition, which will help shape the vision, policies, and guidelines in the OCP and help to preserve Central Saanich's unique community character. Again, not in any particular order here, but some common themes that started to arise are, broadly speaking, the relationship between compact villages, rolling hills, and agricultural lands. Some ideas or concepts include the quiet atmosphere, a sense of authenticity, connection and belonging, close-knit and neighborly. The presence of farming activity or the working landscape, along with the natural beauty, are important features. And some specific places that best represent rural and small town character include Centennial Park, Pioneer Park, Todd Inlet, the Prairie Inn, West Saanich Schoolhouse, and Mount St. Newton Crossroad. So those are some of the themes that have been coming out of that engagement. And those are just a taste of the preliminary results from engagement to date. Now I'll pass it over to Rob to take us through the panel presentations and the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Michael. Okay, folks, so we now have 5 presentations, and these presentations are going to be pretty rapid fire. We've asked panelists to keep it to about 8 minutes each. So they're going to take us to about the 7 o'clock mark. And then at the end of the presentations will be your turn to ask questions. And so, as Jarrett and Michael have mentioned, we'll have the Q&A portion there. So you will see that, that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can write questions and also upvote questions. So I do want to emphasize that these presentations at the moment are not draft plan proposals. They're very much in the idea form, and the idea here is we're really trying to seed the conversation with ideas, opportunities, and possibilities. So please listen to them in that spirit. So first up, we have my colleague, Edward Porter, Principal and Senior Urban Designer at Modus. Over to you, Edward.
Thank you, Rob. I'm hitting start on my 8-minute time. And here we go. Thanks, everyone. This is an exciting time to be a part of this project. And I'm going to begin with this discussion, a fairly high-level discussion around economic development through the lens of urban design, or as I've noted it here, called having our cake while eating our cake. So before we advance, I'm going to offer that there's a frame of consideration here. When we think about economic development, what I'd like to emphasize is the origin of that term, economics being the origin of eco and home, and economics being accounting for the home. So are we balancing our books? Are we living beyond our means? Urban design, on the other hand, but very much related, is around urban, meaning the study of or the nature of settlements and how we live in a place, and design, about being intentional about how we approach that. So there's a lot of connectivity here around economic development and tying that directly to how we make place. In this presentation, I'm basically going to run through 3 different big areas. One, a presentation of a theoretical model that's going to help us to have this conversation and think about the opportunities in the region. I'm going to talk about some local observations around economic development opportunities, and then I'm going to get into a case study around one particular area of economic development. So with that, we'll move on, and I'll see if I can stick to my 8 minutes. For context on the economic model, I wanted to introduce folks, if you haven't heard of it already or aren't familiar with it, with the donut economics model. So it's an economic model, as you can see in the diagram, that really emphasizes this idea that we have limitations. We have a ceiling, an ecological ceiling, beyond which we're living beyond our means. We're an overshoot. And we have social foundations that we're trying to preserve. So beneath which we're not living in the most safe and just space for our communities. So this model is really what we're trying to target here in terms of the optimum middle sweet spot between shortfall and overshoot. And the question then becomes, well, what does that donut economy look like, and what does donut economic development look like as it relates to Central Saanich? So to help us with that, I introduced the other model, and this is a diagram and a tool called the transect. And all this is going to do is create a bit of a cartoon that shows you a range of the region. We know we live in this beautiful and diverse region, diverse landscapes, et cetera, and this drawing helps us understand that. So we'll move through this quickly. To the left-hand side, you'll see a slice that represents natural areas. Next to it, the rural landscapes. Next to that, suburban neighborhoods. Next to that are villages and commercial nodes. You get into some of the more urban conditions. And within the region, you even have downtowns like you would see more in a place like Sydney, not so much in Central Saanich. Finally, you have these areas that we refer to as special districts, which largely have rules that are a little bit different. So you see places like industrial areas or the ferry terminal, or even a case like Bouchard Gardens, where it's such a large landscape feature. It's not a natural space per se, but it's kind of its own special place that has some of its own special rules. So as we start to understand that model, and we start to understand how then considering strategies for urban design and placemaking across that range of diverse landscape really inspires us to approach economic development opportunities, we start to think about designing with nature, working with landscapes and open space recreation, looking at more intensive utilization of land and creating those open spaces that then become places for social connection. Then our streets even become more activated for people and supporting of local storefronts and local commercial retail. And then finally, in those downtown conditions where almost more of our landscape is defined by buildings, we recognize how those buildings support the fabric of our communities through diversity of housing types, through diversity of commercial spaces, and how that all works together in this diverse region. So there's your theoretical framework. When we start to apply that to what we see in the region, have to highlight some of the big drivers of economic development with destination tourism. The next slide, we start to recognize that these places by their nature, and particularly as they relate to the region, are decentralized. They tend to be off the beaten path because people are trying to discover these places. In many cases, almost always, they're place-based. There's a strong emphasis towards conservation of place because the value of those places in tourism is because it's the experience of that place. And not to diminish the spin-off value that all of these place-based tourism features then have to other sectors within our local economy. Moving on, very much related to that larger landscape is the working landscape. So looking at agriculture and the working landscape, and Ione will speak to that in greater depth later this evening. But two defining features of that economic generating kind of sector is typically a more extensive footprint, and then similar to destination tourism or that open space tourism aspect, oftentimes these landscapes are also very closely associated with landscape character and a region sense of place. So there's also a very strong sense of conservation towards these working landscapes. Moving along to the sort of the power and the framework of these local community nodes, what we almost typically associate with as villages. In the next slide, we start to highlight some of the defining features here, particularly if they're more integrated with our transportation nodes. And Tim will speak to that a little bit more. They're highly walkable, and within that sort of catchment of 5-minute walking distances that we like to look at and like to optimize our neighborhoods around that scale, you're dealing with 125 acres of lands that can be serviced by those walkable centers. This is where you really start to see the local economic development around startups and storefronts and that local retail commercial, that finer grain commercial activity. And then next is really the place I want to spend a little bit of time in highlighting the Keating industrial area as a real driving force of economic development within Central Saanich and the region beyond. This one also, just to highlight back to that the theoretical model, that it really is very much more a special district. It's a place where rules are effectively managed to support this unique unique context around what it contains. So in many ways, it's defined as this established regional hub for service commercial. It is significant in its scale, around 275 acres, not including some of the adjacent lands that have some relationship to the operations in the industrial area. It's defined by the infrastructure that services it and the investment, both for the improvements to those areas as well as increased transportation investment that's forthcoming as well. It's also defined by a commuting workforce that a lot of workers actually move into the region to spend time and go to work in the Keating industrial area. And then we also have to recognize that there are emerging trends in growth and demand for industry, and some of the opportunities that we see here we need to balance with the development pressures or opportunities here at the Keating industrial area. So when you mix these things together, some of those opportunities that we start to see, and in the next slide, we start to think again about how we apply those strategies of the transect to this and start to think about the Keating industrial area as a master plan in and of itself. So how can we look at intensification? Looking at intensification of the uses on site, looking at ways that eco-industrial networking or different operators might be able to rely on some of their own resources through partnerships, as well as stacking and placing more intensity within the operations. We look at opportunities to bring employee housing on site or adjacent to support more of a local community there. How do we preserve affordability of the industrial lands in light of those growing values and housing, et cetera? And looking at master planning while we examine those questions and conditions to consider the adjacencies and the landscape adjacent. Finally, there's some opportunities to consider end use planning where you may have extractive activities today and you want to think 20, 30, 50 years down the road as to where those lands could go in the future to support these larger goals. So finally, looking back to those bigger ideas of designing with nature, working landscapes and open space recreation, creating those places for social connection, animating those streets for people and more active storefronts, and building community and supporting local economic development. Here's an image of what an example of an industrial park or an industrial area more optimized in that realm might look like. And there's a larger image there of the region. So a huge opportunity. Thank you very much. A little bit over time. I'll pass the mic. Thanks, Rob.
Great. Thanks very much, Edward. All right, our next presenter is Tim Shaw, and Tim is Senior Transportation Planner at Watt Consulting Group. Over to you, Tim.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. So yeah, I'm going to jump right into the numbers, looking at travel patterns in the district today. So we've got just over 6 daily trips per household in central Saanich, about 2 vehicles per household. The average annual household transportation cost is about $15,400, which is above the CRD average, which is hovering around $14,000 or so. If you look at the pie chart on the right-hand side there, you can see it's showing commute trips by mode share, and by far and away, vehicle driver or single occupancy vehicle over 80% is how most people commute from central Saanich. And that's on the higher end of the CRD. It's not the highest, but it's definitely one of the highest among CRD communities. About 14% or so of trips are made by a sustainable mode, walking, biking, or transit. Next slide. So this map here is showing the top 5 destinations from central Saanich in the morning period, the AM peak period. So people in central Saanich, of course, travel to various parts of the region, but the top 5 include the district of Saanich, so Saanich North, Saanich East, Sydney, North Saanich, and of course within central Saanich itself. Next slide. There's quite a bit of policy and planning context already that sort of set the stage for the OCP. Of course, the current OCP has quite a bit of direction on transportation. There are 3 main transportation objectives, including 1, to provide an efficient municipal road system that is safe and accessible to all modes of transportation. Secondly, to minimize the impact of roads and highways on residential neighborhoods and agricultural areas. And finally, to emphasize walking, cycling, transit use, and other sustainable forms of transportation over private vehicle use for all trips. Next slide. Another important planning document that's currently in draft stage on the website is the Active Transportation Plan, which is currently open for feedback. So if you haven't already submitted your feedback, please go ahead and check it out. It provides a framework to improve pedestrian, cycling, transit, and traffic safety within the district, based on almost a 2-year process to actually develop the plan document, where there was lots of community outreach and engagement, and a lot of technical analysis to really understand the issues facing the active transportation network. And as you can see in the vision statement, it's quite clear that the district wants to develop an active transportation network that is truly designed for all ages and abilities, from children all the way to seniors. Next slide. Another important planning document is the Climate Leadership Plan. And as you can see, there's a pretty bold target to hit net zero emissions, municipal emissions, and community emissions by 2050, with an interim target of 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2007 levels by 2030. Now, why is this relevant to transportation? Well, we know that in 2007, almost 66% or so of the total emissions were from transportation. So it's a very important sector in that regard. There are 2 key transportation targets, which include 50% of trips are made by active transportation or transit by 2050. So it's quite bold, but doable. And the second is 25% of vehicles are zero emissions by 2030 and 100% as zero emissions by 2050. Next slide. Another document here from the district is the electric vehicle and electric bike strategy, which identifies a number of different actions that can be adopted to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles and electric bikes. One thing worth noting is that the land use bylaw was recently amended to require new developments to be EV ready. And what that means is it's providing the electrical wiring in place that can provide power to an electric vehicle charging station when it's actually installed. Next slide. There are a number of distinct transportation challenges facing the district today, starting off with traffic volumes, delay, and congestion. As you can see in the map here, some of the current bottlenecks include Mount Newton Cross Road, Keating Cross Road, and also West Saanich Road, where you see roughly 10 to 15,000 average daily traffic. We know that the intersection of Mount Newton Cross Road and Highway 17 is getting more and more congested, especially as the region continues to grow. And also the turning movements off of Highway 17 to East Saanich Road and Keating Cross Road are experiencing some delay as well. Next slide. Traffic safety in intersections is another challenge facing the district. The intersection of West Saanich Road, Benvenuto Avenue, and Keating Cross Road saw about 41 collisions from 2013 to 2017. So it's definitely one of the hot spots. The picture on the slide here, I'm sure most people are familiar with, it's the Highway 17 turnoff to Keating Cross Road, where there are quite a few delays right now. But the good thing is that the BC Ministry of Transportation is planning an overpass at this location, a flyover. There's a lot of information about that project online, so go check it out if you haven't already. And finally, there's a desire for a greater separation between vehicle traffic and then, of course, pedestrians and cyclists. Next slide. Transit is another challenge facing the district. We know only about 2% of trips within the district today are made by transit. The top challenges, according to some of the feedback that was heard through the active transportation plan, include infrequent service, not serving riders' destinations, and just overall time constraints. There's a desire to see more frequent service during the morning period, expanding service coverage along key corridors like West Saanich Road and Mount Newton Cross Road, and lastly, more direct service to downtown Victoria. Next slide. Walking. So this is well documented in the active transportation plan, but one of the main issues in the district today is just the lack of sidewalks in certain locations or just poor sidewalk condition. What the community has communicated is a desire to see improvements to the condition and connectivity of sidewalks, and also improving crossing locations and increasing the number of safe crosswalks. Next slide. Cycling is another really a big important topic and also a challenge today. The map on the right there does show the existing bike facilities in the district. So there are a number of bike facilities already today, but they're not nearly adequate to meet the needs of the community. So there's a lack of dedicated on-street bike lanes. There's just various gaps throughout the cycling network. There's a lack of separation between cycling facilities and traffic. And there is a desire to see safer cycling routes with separation from traffic and more paved trails or multi-use pathways. Of course, there are more improvements than that, but those are just a few to highlight. So looking ahead, so some of the topics that we would like to explore as part of the OCP review and update include electric transportation. So continuing to look at opportunities for where public electric vehicle charging stations can go to address range anxiety and also increase uptake. For e-bikes, a whole bunch of actions, but one could include a municipal top-up for e-bikes, so a top-up on the provincial rebate that's currently available to make e-bikes more affordable. Transit, there is a Peninsula Local Area Transit Plan that is underway by BC Transit, which is going to look at services and routes within the peninsula. A lot more information will be available online and ways to get involved. And then new bus shelters. The district is continuing to add new shelters on a regular basis. Next slide. I'm getting close to the end of my time here, so please go to my final slide. So just to wrap up here, so some sort of big ideas or preliminary ideas that I have for the OCP. One is to explore a transportation mode hierarchy, so it's very clear what the priorities are for the district with respect to the different transportation modes. Setting mode share targets that align with the climate targets in the Climate Leadership Plan, making sure that sustainable transportation is at the forefront. And of course, we cannot forget about cars, though. Traffic congestion is a problem, so we need to find solutions to make sure that issue is addressed. And then finally, moving towards electrifying transportation. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks so much, Tim, and thanks for both of you for keeping pretty close to time on your presentations. I'll just note there's a couple of questions, Tim, directed probably your way in the Q&A, so take a look at those if you would, and we'll get to those answers after the presentation. So next up is Mike Coulthard, who's principal with and senior forester and biologist with Diamond Head Consulting. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Rob. I will be discussing, I guess, a whole range of topics related to the OCP update and managing the natural environment. So please go to the first slide, Mike. In general, the peninsula, Central Saanich has an amazing amount of biodiversity. There's a dynamic and diverse forestal areas that border both sides of the district. These areas are amazing. They have a ton of energy. They include rocky shorelines, beaches, mudflats, intertidal marshes. These areas provide a lot of habitat for both terrestrial and aquatic species. There's many streams, ditches, wetlands that exist throughout the district in the urban areas, the natural areas, and throughout the many agricultural areas that provide very high value. There's a mix of habitat types from older mature forests to young forests, shrubs, old field habitats, and agricultural fields, which provide a great diversity of habitat for many species. There's also large protected natural areas, including John Dean and Gowan Todd Provincial Parks. The district does have a solid foundation for protecting environmental features and functions through its environmental development permit areas, its tree bylaw. There are, however, a number of emerging challenges and sort of related to the changing environment, and lots of opportunities to strengthen this protection of these features and functions. Next slide, please. So the first one, which will be discussed tonight in more detail, is the changing climate. As we know, the climate is changing. It's getting hotter, it's getting drier, there's more extreme weather events. These changes to the sort of the temperature and the seasons are affecting which species are able to survive here. So we are getting an invasion of non-native species, both animals and plants are able to establish here. There are also pests and diseases that are often controlled by weather patterns that are able to sort of enlarge, and infestations can increase and outbreak, such as the mountain pine beetle. There's movements of pests and diseases from down south up north as it gets warmer. This affects our forests, our natural areas, as well as our agricultural areas. There's high intensity windstorms or higher intensity storms that will be that are predicted. These have in the past and are starting to cause more wind throw, which is a great risk in urban areas with our beautiful trees, our beautiful large trees. It's hotter and drier in the summer, so wildfire becomes a bigger risk. And there's also sea level rise associated with climate change. So in lowland areas where structures are built close to lowland areas with storm surges, there's a risk of increasing ocean onto these structures and facilities and the natural areas in lowland parts of the peninsula. Next slide, please. So there's climate changes are one big change or one big factor affecting the environment. The second one is, of course, development pressure. So across the region, there's pressure to develop. People love living here for good reason. Development as we build structures, as we build roads, as we build servicing, they often encroach into the existing natural areas. Our forests, our natural areas have amazing trees, beautiful big trees that we can grow, but they require space and soil volume to survive. Coming too close to them, cutting into them can make them unstable, making them unhealthy, and destabilizing them, which again is a big risk to our urban development areas. As we build, we also change hydrology. This can affect the adjacent natural areas. The underground water flow to these areas changes, and it changes their growing environments. The marine shorelines, freshwater areas, those are very sensitive features to development impacts, to the influx of pollution. And again, larger natural areas. We have a lot of the wildlife we see in our urban centers are very somewhat tolerant of us. There's a lot of species and species at risk that need refuge areas, that need large areas away from human development to survive. Next slide, please. I touched on this about climate change, but as we get closer to natural areas, get denser, there's interface risks and impacts. So wildfire being one of them, of course. So again, it's getting hotter and drier in the summers. There's increased risk of wildfires. Now, this risk is not just of wildfires coming from the natural areas affecting our homes. It's also wildfires starting in our homes and spreading to these natural areas. As we create new clearings into forested areas, we can expose trees that aren't necessarily adapted or wind firm. These can then become a risk of a wind throw during big windstorm events. As we get closer to natural areas, with our gardening practices, unfortunately, we can introduce invasive species into these natural areas. We also increase the risk of conflicts with our residents and wildlife. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the district does have a great foundation of policy for protecting the environment. However, there are opportunities through this OCP to review this policy and strengthen it in areas. The first one with trees, the district does have a tree protection bylaw, which is currently being reviewed. This is a very important tool for protecting the natural environment because most of our natural areas support trees. Trees love growing here, and if there's an opportunity, generally trees will take root. So that's a great tool for protecting the natural environment. The tree bylaw can also be closely tied to development permit guidelines and requirements. There's also an opportunity to strengthen the district's sort of overarching vision of the urban forest. There are urban forest strategies being developed now that provide a great snapshot of the condition of the urban forest, the diversity of tree species, and provide sort of a long-term vision for how to manage that forest area. Biodiversity, again, the district has a fantastic environment. It's very diverse. In order to manage it, in order to manage biodiversity, we do need to understand where these sensitive features and functions are. So in general, with this OCP update, with all of natural sort of features and functions, updating the mapping and understanding of where these things are is very important. Managing invasive species is very important. That's a very significant threat to our biodiversity. As well, an option to protect the green infrastructure network, or a network of core hub areas and corridors over time that will ensure that these species are able to take advantage of all the amazing habitats within the district. Next slide, please. And I apologize, I'm going to speed up. I'm running out of time here as well. Streams are huge, a huge, amazing, sensitive feature throughout our cities. They are managed to a minimum standard through the provincial regulations. These are enforced by district policy. However, those are minimum provincial standards, and there are opportunities to increase those protection measures. It is challenging also, these measures do not apply to the agricultural land reserve. And so there are different kinds of opportunities, incentive-based, voluntary-based, to protect streams and water courses throughout the agricultural land reserve areas. Very important, again, to update mapping of these features so people have transparency of where they are. Foreshore and marine ecology, again, as I mentioned, extremely diverse, extremely valuable. So the Marine Shoreline DPA, which is a fantastic policy, can be reviewed and possibly strengthened. Last slide, please. I mentioned wildfire. Again, a district does have a community wildfire protection plan, which helps to manage or help the district determine how to prepare for a wildfire event and prevent one. As a part of this, a wildfire DP area is likely to be explored, which is a development permit area to help treat building materials, landscaping, and those interface fuels between urban areas and the fuels. And finally, agricultural areas. The agricultural areas do provide a lot of opportunity to enhance biodiversity, providing naturalized buffers between urban areas and agricultural fields, naturalizing water courses, wetlands, planting hedgerows. These are all fantastic measures for increasing biodiversity in these lands. Okay, I'm sorry I went a bit over with my time. I'll pass that back to you, Rob. Look forward to discussing these topics more with everyone later.
Great, thanks, Mike. And you're not far off your time there. Okay, next up is Jessica Shoebridge, and Jessica is founder and principal with Thrive Consulting. She's going to talk to us about climate change and resilience. Over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Rob. Next slide, please. I just wanted to start with some of the global context, in that recognizing that, we are a local community here in British Columbia, but the challenges of climate change are faced by communities around the globe. So this riskier future that we all face collectively is not uncommon. It's a challenge that everyone's facing. And so the things that are making our future riskier include things like this warming climate, increasing populations, more development in hazardous areas, all of these stresses. But we have this choice for a less risky future, and a community OCP is really one of those key opportunities to take us down this path towards a less risky future. And just for context, my content, my presentation really focuses on more of the adaptation side of climate. So many of the other presenters focus more on some of the mitigation pieces in terms of active transportation and specifics of growth management that help us reduce our emissions. And my work really focuses more on the adaptation and disaster risk reduction side of things. And so one of the other global components, other than the atmosphere itself, is often capital. And so we see Moody's as a rating agency that has started warning cities and other local authorities to address climate risk or face a credit downgrade. And so this is where the quote of the nice to have becoming a must do comes in that I've worked in this field for over a decade now, and communities at the forefront, I guess, of natural hazard risk management have been looking at these topics for a while, but I think there's increasing pressures for local authorities to address natural hazard risk and climate risk. So, and the other headline here is just how at the federal level, we see these increasing costs in terms of managing disasters and extreme weather events. And so both the province and the feds are looking at how they can kind of offload some of climate risk in a sense, and try and get out of some of the disaster financial assistance payments. Next slide, please. So taking that global context more down to the ground here in Central Saanich, the current OCP has this, kind of, I would call it a nice to have, regulate development to avoid negative impacts, particularly in environmentally sensitive areas and in areas where hazards exist due to unstable soils, flooding, or erosion potential. So that was in the current OCP, recognizing that there is hazardous areas. And I think there's just this increased need to look at those hazardous areas, the accordant risks, and plan accordingly. And so already identified in Central Saanich as a result of our changing climate, Central Saanich will experience hotter summer days, longer summer droughts, warmer winters, more extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and changes to water supply. So these are the impacts that have already been identified as needing to be addressed. Next slide, please. Again, just trying to focus on, those expected changes, the increased intensity and frequency of hazard events. What are these kind of common ways, common opportunities of addressing those increasing risks? So as the climate leadership for Central Saanich talks about as well, this increased need to focus on assessing and communicating risk, which is described as undertaking a risk and vulnerability assessment, and increasing the public awareness of the risks and adaptation strategies. And so we're seeing an evolution in terms of collaborating to better understand the risk on the island. It's happening every day. We're seeing more and more collaboration to understand these risks collectively. Reducing and managing the risk itself is, again, the OCP is a huge opportunity to stop new risk. So, don't plan increased density in very hazardous areas is the first smart thing to do. And then assessing the risk in areas that are already developed that might be potentially hazardous. And then transferring risk through insurance and other mechanisms, but also recognizing that we're facing these events now. So being prepared to respond, recover, and build back better. Next slide, please. Again, another opportunity, which is very relevant on the Saanich Peninsula. And again, there is this regional collaboration to better understand sea level rise as a hazard. So this, we see the increasing hazard and the potential increasing risk, and we understand that we need to better collaborate to understand this and address it. So there is this regional effort to better understand inundation on the peninsula and more broadly in the CRD. So understanding that water is a system, it's more regional, it doesn't see the lines on the map between local authorities often. So it does lead to that increased regional collaboration, and the district has been involved in the Vancouver Island Coastal Communities draft plan. And I put the question mark living with water approaches, because it really is, it's up to the community to decide what the best solutions are, adaptation strategies are. But increasingly I'm seeing, communities around BC really taking kind of natural infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure approaches, looking at those a lot more seriously to deal with sea level rise. Next slide, please. Again, just reinforcing some opportunities that have been mentioned. Land use planning and local area redevelopment, obviously very relevant when you're thinking about reviewing an OCP. And as just was mentioned, hazard-specific development permit areas for what we like to call the WUI, the Wildfire Urban Interface. So it sounds like that's already being contemplated. Sea level rise action planning areas, and resilient zones. So if you are thinking about a local area redevelopment, taking that resilient zone kind of lens to think about the buildings and the infrastructure in a given area. And so something like a hazard DPA filters into the next point, which is using a hazard DPA to specify, as was mentioned, you can specify in a hazard DPA certain building materials, certain practices to help foster resilience. And from what I'm hearing, this PACE idea, property assessed clean energy, is very much a topic in this community, and this community seems to be leading on this. So it's an opportunity to finance retrofits, but it's also an opportunity to finance resilience in new buildings. And And so you can use PACE both for energy side of the equation and resilience. The research that I was recently doing in this space looked at what's happening in the US, specifically on the resilience side of things, and looking at how PACE is being used to address seismic, storm, hurricanes, drought all throughout the US. So it's a really exciting opportunity, and it's currently being rolled out. I shouldn't say rolled out, maybe not that, maybe not at that point yet, but it's a major topic right now, and the province has invested significantly. Agriculture, again, I don't want to go into too much. I know the next speaker will cover this, but it's a huge area to think about adaptation and resilience, from adapting for heat and water, and the changing hazards in that space, sequestering more carbon, looking at payment for ecosystem services, perhaps that's maybe more in collaboration with the province, but also increasing island food security. If you're an agriculturally rich community, you have this potential to increase food security across the island. There's an anecdote about a major seismic event in the province and how the island will run out of food in, I don't know, 3 days or something crazy. So it's an opportunity there. Next slide, please. And again, just reimagining public spaces and community amenities for what we call low carbon resilience, which is just really a fancy way of saying, taking into account both mitigation and adaptation at the same time. So thinking about reducing our emissions, sequestering carbon, things like that, and adapting and increasing our resilience at the same time. I just love this image from the peninsula because it really illustrates, we can think about these public areas or shorelines as a way to both, preserve or restore ecosystems, which is great from a mitigation standpoint, but also can help, buffer against storms, support dealing with coastal erosion. So I think it's one of those win-win-win types of opportunities. Final slide, please. Just a couple more bold ideas and opportunities. Applying this climate action and low carbon resilience lens for the whole OCP review. This is a key moment in your communities, in the history of this community. An OCP review really is a chance to take a climate action type lens, and having declared a climate emergency, this is really key. You're setting the community up for several decades of opportunity in this space. I already talked about PACE financing. Integrating seismic, don't forget the seismic hazard, please. It's a major hazard of concern in Southwest BC, so don't maladapt across the major hazards. Strengthening local supply chains, thinking about this from a waste perspective. I already mentioned food, building materials. I think as everybody's experienced from the COVID situation, how that affects our supply chains, it can be devastating to businesses and communities. And again, just encouraging the community conversations in this space. I've been in conversations around sea level rise for many, many years now. It can be contentious, it can be difficult, but I think they're really important community conversations to have. And there's lots of rich solutions that come from engaging, across the community on these topics. So you guys are well positioned to make a big difference here. Thanks for your time.
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. Really appreciate that. Okay, our next presenter is, and final presenter is Ione Smith, Director from Uplands Agricultural Consulting. Over to you,
Great.
Ione.
Thanks so much, Rob. So I'm going to dive right into it. So I'm just starting off here with some information from the agricultural land use inventory that was conducted by the BC Ministry of Agriculture in 2018, which found that there was approximately 2,500 hectares of land in the ALR within central Saanich. About 60% of that is being actively farmed, and another 15% would be available for farming fairly easily, but the rest would be considered unavailable. And unavailable for farming, as defined by the Ministry of Agriculture, is essentially land that might be alienated due to roads or utilities or lakes, wetlands, or rocky areas. These numbers are not unusual on a community by community basis. And in fact, 60% of farmland being actively farmed is on the fairly high side. So, it goes without saying that agriculture is an active part of the local economy and local land use within central Saanich. Next slide, please. So what is happening on that land? Well, there's quite a lot of hay and forage crops, pasture as well. So that's not surprising. That often goes hand in hand either with marginal lands or for farms that have livestock operations. But there's also over 200 hectares of mixed vegetable production. That's quite a lot for a fairly small community. You've also got quite a lot of grains, so barley, for example, and oats, corn, nursery crops, grapes, wheat, for example. But it's important to keep in mind that not all land is capable of growing those high value crops like fruit, vegetables, and that sort of thing. So it could be an indication sort of the quality of the land as well. And it's also important to keep in mind that hay and pasture production can benefit the food system. So it's important to be able to grow good quality hay in order to create feed for animals. It's important to keep land aside for pasture production for livestock as well. And another thing that's good to point out is that we can create regulations to restrict or limit certain types of crop production, as the province has done with cannabis, but there are no regulations and there's no regulatory levers that can force somebody to grow something specific or grow anything at all, actually. There's tools and mechanisms and motivators for using agricultural land, but there's nothing that can require somebody to be productive. And at the end of the day, farmers are business owners, and so they're responding to market signals. Next slide, please. In terms of livestock, there were 210 farms or parcels within the central Saanich area that were found to have livestock on it. The most popular one, probably not surprising to everybody, was equine, so horses and ponies. That's followed by chickens, beef, sheep, to a lesser degree, bees, pigs, goats, turkeys, and that sort of thing. The main thing that's missing from central Saanich in terms of their food system is dairy production. And I don't want to single out horses necessarily in a negative light. Horse farms can also play an important role. They can be a generator of manure for compost. They can also attract agricultural businesses and support services to the area, which can then serve to really benefit the entire agricultural community. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about jobs in the economy and how agriculture relates to that sector. Local farms, it goes without saying, create local jobs. That might not always be evident at the field level. We often see people who are laboring from outside of the community, sometimes from outside of the country, and they're often doing some of that hardest work. But farms and farm products do spur on local jobs throughout the entire food system, from production to processing, distribution, retail, even waste management. There's also evidence of a large number of secondary jobs that are associated with food production, like equipment sales, agricultural fairs, markets, business planning, agritourism, crop consulting. You can bet that if your food is being produced elsewhere, there's definitely the jobs are being created elsewhere as well. So it's important to keep in mind that jobs are created throughout the entire food system spectrum, not just farming and production itself. It could be managing cold storage, operating licensed abattoirs, cut and wrap facilities, distribution centers, food hubs, and so on. There's lots of opportunities to align, for example, the production of organic matter, compost, and soil amendments, or even biofuels with the management of composting of farm wastes. But at the local government level, a fine balance has to be struck between increasing the availability of servicing infrastructure to these rural areas in order to accommodate food processing, while also ensuring that the overall intensity of non-farm uses within the agricultural land reserve is not necessarily encouraged. So in many cases, it may be most appropriate to identify lands outside the ALR, such as light industrial or commercial zones, as was done in the previous OCP, I believe, for the Keating area, to accommodate that type of infrastructure. I just want to note that there was a great study done by Kwantlen Polytechnic out of Richmond in 2013 that looked at underutilized farmland that was owned by the city of Surrey. That was 280 acres of publicly owned lands. And the research suggested that if that land was brought into production, it had the potential to contribute over $15 million in gross revenue to Surrey's economy, and it could create between 100 and 136 full-time equivalent jobs. So nearly one full-time job for every 2 acres of that land. Next slide, please. I want to touch also on housing and affordability. So agricultural land also serves many positive functions. There's competing interests though, right, for farmland. And farmland in southern Vancouver Island is amongst the most expensive in Canada. In 2019, Farm Credit Canada noted that the price of farmland on Vancouver Island rose by 13% in 1 year, with the Saanich Peninsula having the greatest increase in farmland values. So now valuing up to $100,000 an acre, if not more. So even though it's expensive for farming, it's actually pretty cheap for other uses. So when compared to residentially zoned, industrial zoned land, it's still considered fairly affordable. So that creates pressure on both ends to use farmland for other uses. And then you've got land outside the urban growth boundary that's not necessarily in the ALR, but capable of growing food. And so those are under even another additional layer of pressure to expand the residential footprint that way. So we have to continue to protect farmland and reinforce the urban growth areas, because doing so will also ensure that that low density development is kept in check. And that'll lead to a greater variety of housing types and hopefully housing prices and affordability as well. Next slide, please. I want to touch a little bit on access to farmland, because that goes hand in hand with the cost of land. Since it's becoming more and more difficult for new and emerging farmers to access land, there have been recent local and regional initiatives, such as the Capital Regional District's Farmland Trust Initiative, and that points to broad support for increasing productivity on farmlands. So those efforts need to garner continued support by partnering with other municipalities, such as the District of Saanich next door, to ensure that that Farmland Trust Initiative maintains momentum. The zoning of public land should also prioritize agriculture, such as opening up long-term leases for farmers or to existing organizations like CR Fair and through Young Agrarians, as these are key partners in tackling that farmland access challenge. In addition to Maber Flats, which I've noted on the slide, there's also Newman Farm and other really nice jewels of farmland opportunities within Central Saanich. Next slide, please, is my last slide. So wildlife impacts on farmland can be more than just a nuisance. It can actually cause recurring financial impacts to farmers over the long term. There have been interesting and successful local and regional initiatives partnering with local First Nations to collaborate on innovative management solutions, and those can be effective opportunities moving forward. There's also concerns around pollution. That could be nutrient runoff, it could be pesticide runoff, it could be soil erosion. There is an important role, though, that agricultural landscapes play in the protection of ecosystem services, going back to what my colleagues were saying. Things like permaculture, regenerative agriculture, green infrastructure, these are becoming more mainstream and more established. There's newer provincially funded programs, such as the Farmland Advantage program, which aims to provide economic compensation for farmers who are taking an active role in protecting and enhancing this natural habitat. It goes without saying that some of the most biodiverse areas of British Columbia are found in our agriculturally important regions, such as Vancouver Island, Southern Vancouver Island in particular. And protecting biodiversity and riparian ecosystem health on agricultural land at the local level can help to benefit the community and mitigate climate change impacts by preventing things like runoff, erosion, by managing floods, by reducing wildfire risk. Climate change might also bring positive impacts to agriculture too, such as opening up the ability to grow a greater diversity of crops over the longer growing season. But negative impacts can include emerging new pests and diseases, increased flooding, as I mentioned, or the prevalence of drought conditions. There's lots of discussion lately around whether or not farmland is a good use of carbon sequestration tools by promoting soil health. And early indications and research shows that it is, but I think that type of science needs a little bit more work, to be honest, to figure out, how great of a tool it can be, because carbon is often being released by farming activities too. So that area is emerging, and I think it requires a bit more of an examination. But there's great partnerships that can exist with initiatives like the BC Agriculture and Food Climate Action Initiative to further assist in ensuring that local food producers are being equipped well with tools to navigate climate change. And there's federal funding too that's coming out. Actually, some was just announced in the last few days through things like the federal government's Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy targets and plans. And that's going to be working towards things like climate change adaptation, mitigation, and looking at farmland as a real partner there. So that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ione. Thanks to all the panelists. So lots to think about in those 5 presentations. And I see that we already have quite a number of questions. So just to remind you, we have a Q&A panel, which is down at the bottom right of your screen. So please use that for your questions. Don't put them in the chat box. And so you can type in your questions in that Q&A panel. You can also upvote the questions. So if you think a question is one that you would really like to see answered, you can click the little thumb there and give it a like, and that will rise to the top of our pile. I just want to remind everybody also that the event has been recorded, and we're going to be posting it online to the project website in the next few days. And that address is letstalkcentralsaanich.ca/OCP. So If we don't manage to get to answer all of the questions, we'll try and answer those questions and post them onto the website in the next few days. So we're going to go to our first question. And this one is a broad question. Someone's asking, what about housing? And I wonder if Jarrett might be able to talk about the infill study that's been going on in the past several months and how that's been addressing housing and in the lead up to the OCP.
Yes, thank you, Rob. So a strategic initiative of council was to undertake a residential infill and densification study. And so the district has gone through a comprehensive project. Really starting in 2018, we did some public engagement around that, just trying to identify what the community's needs were for housing. And so the first phase of that was our policy development and design guidelines. So we did update our official community plan with, I would say, some fairly substantial changes around helping to guide infill development in our community. So the exercise was not around how do we accommodate growth. That was not what it was. It was it wasn't about how do we grow more. It was about how do we accommodate the anticipated and expected growth that Central Saanich has been seeing for years. So developing design guidelines around infill development and what we want those houses to look like, establishing different criteria and policy about where that development should go within our neighborhoods, closer to our cores, really helping to avoid that sprawl that we all don't want to see in Central Saanich. So confining that to the urban containment boundary and establishing design guidelines for what that would look like. However, as part of that, in the last phase, which we're still working on, is our updates to our land use bylaw. And so we actually have a public hearing scheduled for April 20th for council to hear from the community about our infill and residential updates to our land use bylaw. Some of the key things we're looking at is permitting cottages in backyards as an alternative to a secondary suite, for example, allowing for some increased duplexes. So densifying that sort of modest densification within our urban centers. So the OCP will still continue to look at housing though. So workforce housing, for example, for Keating Business District is a part of this. We just had a housing needs assessment completed as well, which is a provincial requirement that was done just at the end of last year. So it's very relevant, and that information for that is informing our official community plan about our official community plan review about what housing we need for affordability, rental housing, special needs housing, and what have you. So it's still a topic area of this OCP review, but a lot of work has been done over the last 2 years, which is being integrated into the OCP. So thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Jarrett. Okay, we have a question about agriculture and the ALR here. So Ione, you mentioned a number of positive benefits of agriculture and farming in the community. This question is about some of the more negative impacts and whether we can do anything about it as a municipality. So some of the most significant environmental concerns are to do with farming activities. These are to do with drainage, pesticide use, removal of hedgerows and trees, etc. Most of the farmland in the district is within the ALR. And the district has limited influence on decisions of the Agricultural Land Commission. Do you have any ideas to have some influence on the environmental performance of agricultural lands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. So you've got agricultural issues and environmental issues, and each of those in and of themselves have federal, provincial, local, and private land ownership concerns, right? So you're looking at complicated on top of complicated. So the answer is essentially yes, there's things that local governments can do, but it's more around motivation. It's the carrot less so than the stick. And the Ministry of Agriculture also tends to push the carrot. The Ministry of Environment, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, I would say in my experience, is more so the stick, the enforcement piece. So if there really is actual concerns that there's some sort of contamination or pollution occurring that's against what's laid out in the Agricultural Environmental Management Code of Practice. So that is a code of practice that's regulated through the Ministry of Environment, then that is something, you know, that the Ministry of Environment should be called upon. But if we're talking more about what I would categorize as nuisance complaints, so issues around odor or noise and that sort of thing, then there is the Right to Farm Act, and the Right to Farm Act does protect farming if it's within the ALR, and as long as it's considered normal farm practices. What local governments can do, however, and I noticed that it was in the OCP, and there's some great stuff both in the OCP and the Agricultural Area Plan, is to promote the use of environmentally friendly practices, whether it's through the Environmental Farm Plan, whether it's partnering with NGOs such as Ducks Unlimited. There's some great now examples from other regional districts and local governments of partnering with NGOs that can lead to some great partnerships between farmers and biodiversity and habitat organizations. I'm thinking of the South Okanagan, I'm thinking of Delta. The Delta Wildlife Trust, for example, has done quite a lot of work there. So there's great opportunities, and it wouldn't necessarily be reinventing the wheel, but it takes some leadership, and it takes some work for sure.
Great, thank you, Ione. Mike, this might be a question for you. There's a couple of questions about water and the OCP. One's a very general question talking about will water issues be addressed in the OCP? The other's a more specific question about the impact of gravel extraction on water tables. And I'm just wondering if you could speak maybe to how can an OCP think about the water system, hydrology in general, and how can it influence those things?
For surface water and groundwater are a bit different. For surface water, which is where I'd say a lot of the direct impacts are felt and where the environmental values are. Again, there's minimum provincial regulation, or there's minimum provincial standards for protecting water. And as Ione was saying, there's federal and provincial standards indeed in terms of water quality. So the OCP directly can affect that because it can direct a policy which can exceed those standards, for example. So there's minimum standards that have to be met. Many municipalities will exceed those standards. Those are typically riparian setback areas. The groundwater is a bit tricky. You know, the ISMP, or the Integrated Stormwater Management Planning process, typically deals with hydrology at a sort of a landscape level. There's also, you know, in terms of water and water quality, there's you know, engineering and planning have a lot of influence over how the water flows across the urban landscape and then into these natural water features. That's outside of the agricultural land reserve, but that's very important. You know, our roadways, our industrial areas, how that those hard surfaces conduct pollutants down, where they go, where they travel, how they get into our waterways. So there's a lot of ways I think the OCP can direct that, and I think the OCP, the current OCP, speaks very much to protecting these natural water features. But I think some of these standards and policies can be strengthened to improve and understand how this water flows and how to prevent those pollutants from getting into these waterways.
Great, thanks, Mike. Okay, we had a question. I think someone was having trouble with the Q&A and had to ask this question through chat, but it's also a question that is repeated by somebody else in the Q&A as well. So this is around Central Saanich's role within the region, within the CRD. And, you know, given Central Saanich's important role to protect agriculture, can dense housing and agriculture coexist in a favorable way? And maybe Ione, that's one for you to start with, and maybe others can chime in.
Yep, sure. I mean, it certainly can. You only need to look at places really like Burnaby, Richmond, Coquitlam, areas that do have pockets of very rich and fertile farmland that are essentially surrounded by towers and very dense residential areas. And in fact, some studies are showing that there's less likely to be people complaining about farm noises, odors, and complaints if they live in towers next to farmland versus rural residential estates, people who want that quiet, peaceful, bucolic type of experience. So it certainly can. I think design, and maybe, I don't know if Edward could speak to that, but I think design can certainly go a long way in ensuring that that is done in a way where those delineations are kept and respected. You know, the development permit area for farmland protection is a tool that is often underutilized that I'm a really big fan of, and that basically involves design guidelines, setbacks, and buffering on the non-ALR side whenever development either starts or when redevelopment happens as well. So yeah, I think it can be done. It has to be done a bit carefully. And it can also kind of bump up against that rural sort of lifestyle value. So it really is community specific.
Great, thanks. Edward, do you want to talk about Southlands? So you've had some experience designing in the context of urban rural edges.
Yes, and I would say there's a whole world to explore there. So I'll keep it brief. I mean, I think I only hit it on the head. So much of this is about the scale of that interface and the relationship between what's designed on the urban side of this thing versus what operation is occurring on the agricultural side of this. So I think that if you're looking at the interface between compatible farm practices and compatible scale of residential or urban development, I think it can actually be a beautiful relationship. I think you can design that interface in a similar way that you would to any other sort of open space working landscape, and you can actually create ways that farmland and open space obviously benefits residents in terms of their relationship to their place and views and experience. There may be ways to manage people through those landscapes in a way that don't create conflict for agriculture if that's an opportunity. On the flip side, there are ways to bring then, farm gate sales right to a neighborhood center and actually create as part of the urban fabric some of those support systems or amenities within a neighborhood that would actually be active in supporting farm practices. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. And you can start thinking about the way neighborhoods are designed around amenities that actually support farming.
Great, thank you. Okay, there's a question here which I think is related to a lot of what the speakers presented to, and it's about urban containment, and it's related to the previous question in that if you look at an aerial plan map of Central Saanich, it's quite a unique community. You know, you've got these very compact little urban villages and small towns surrounded by this agricultural rural landscape, and it's very distinct in that way. It's like a European landscape in some ways, that you don't have very much sprawl. You have little communities and then you have rural areas. And so the question is, and I'm just trying to find it here, the question is, will the OCP be revisiting the urban containment boundary? And maybe Jarrett could kind of comment on that, but I would like other speakers, Jessica maybe and Tim, to talk about the value of Central Saanich's compact urban villages to issues like resilience and active transportation, if you would. So maybe start with Jarrett and then go to the other two.
Yes, thank you, Rob. So when we launched the OCP review, we took a project charter forward to council, and we gave several options represented, and council gave us direction. And part of that was, this is not a major review of our urban containment boundary. So that's really not something that I think our urban containment boundary is well defined. It does provide so many benefits to Central Saanich, from providing a compact, walkable communities to protecting agriculture. But one component of that, we recognize as we go through these discussions and engagement, some potential minor amendments to the urban containment boundary may be discussed, where there's a need for various reasons, and whatever those reasons may be, that would be identified through our engagement process that we're undertaking here. So nothing's been defined around the urban containment boundary in terms of where modifications might occur, if they occur at all. But it's certainly not major changes to our urban containment boundary. That's not envisioned as part of this plan review.
Great. And Tim, can you talk to the value of Central Saanich's fairly compact urban villages, Brentwood Bay, Keating, to active transportation?
Yeah, will do, Rob. I think they're absolutely critical. And in my presentation, I presented data on commuting mode share, and of course, walking wasn't very high because people are commuting long distances to various parts of the region for work. But if you actually look at other data from the CRD household travel survey, you got roughly almost 14%, close to 14% of trips within Central Saanich are done by foot. And I think that walkability is largely attributed to these compact villages. So the more improvements in terms of sidewalk improvements, crossings, crosswalk locations that can be part of these compact villages, the more you're going to support walkability and make it easy for people to live, work, and play within Central Saanich, in particular in those villages.
Great, thanks, Tim. And Jessica, comments on kind of the urban form from a resilience point of view?
Yeah, I guess my first comment is just kind of anecdotally in the Lower Mainland, how we've somebody who's more intimately involved in flood management than myself in the Lower Mainland has often said that the ALR has been our best flood management tool in British Columbia. So I think it probably applies in this community similarly as it does in the Lower Mainland, that preserving a lot of the ALR land is in fact a risk management tool, if it is indeed similarly susceptible to flood the way it is in the Lower Mainland. And I think just in terms of the urban containment boundary, I think if the community is willing to honestly look at that area and what the hazards are within that area, and just very realistically look at not targeting density in areas that are hazardous. And I'm not familiar enough with the community itself in terms of the hazards within the UCB versus outside of it. But I think that's the point. Don't aim to target future density in areas are hazardous. And so keeping the UCB in place is obviously important for so many reasons, but we talk about smart growth, and we talk about smart growth in smart places. So that's
great. Thank you both. This might be for Edward initially. This is around facilities and pedestrian infrastructure as densification increases. So question is, as densification increases, will areas such as Brentwood Bay and Saanich see additional sidewalks built to promote walking between communities and significant services, i.e. libraries, schools, retail corridors, primary residential corridors? So maybe Edward, some thoughts on, as we densify, what do we need to provide as infrastructure and amenities to make it a livable, sustainable place?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually a bit of a tricky one for me, insofar as I look at this, the streets of Brentwood, and they're just beautiful. They're beautiful because they're so narrow. They're beautiful because you have landscape character right up to the curb edge in many conditions, and so the idea of adding that additional infrastructure comes at a cost of additional clearing within rights of ways and loss of some of that character. So we see that in a lot of places where you're losing a rural character of even, no curbs and gutters and roadside swales. And so there's some trade-offs there. So I think it's something to approach very carefully and certainly to acknowledge and say, yes, as densification increases, there will need to be an effort made to improve pedestrian facility. I think that's the right way to say it. And whether that's a trail network that weaves in a different way through a landscape and still makes those connections, or whether that's something that's more of an engineered edge to a roadway is sort of a more, that's going to be something that you'd have to evaluate more carefully over time. And then each place is different in terms of the density and the road lengths and the destinations between these places as well, and what some of those constraints and opportunities would be. So I think the simple answer, being yes, densification does necessitate that increase in facility and support for pedestrian access. the devil's in the detail in terms of how you get there and how you realize that without compromising some of those other qualities.
Rob, can I add to his answer?
Please do.
So the active transportation plan is in draft form, as I mentioned in my presentation, and it's currently online, open for public feedback. And there's also a survey that's actually open until March 31st. But what I wanted to bring to your attention is that Chapter 4 of the active transportation plan is all about the walking and rolling network. And in that chapter, there's discussion specifically about some of the sidewalk improvements in Brentwood Bay, including, for example, sidewalk improvements on Wallace Drive through Brentwood Bay. And there's also there's a map as well on map 4 of the plan. Nicely shows or clearly illustrates where some of those improvements are specific to Brentwood Bay. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. It should give you a pretty good sense of what some of the proposed improvements are around sidewalk improvements in Brentwood Bay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim. There's a kind of a cluster of questions about housing and affordable housing here. And one of them is it possible to have homes grow up, not out? So, can we have taller, more denser development to address some of our housing needs? Can we allow smaller lot sizes or of half to 1 acre instead of the present 10-acre minimum for some lands within the agricultural area? And that's maybe for you, Ione, to kind of talk about minimum lot sizes, subdivision, the impact on agriculture there. And then there is a question about affordable housing and how is the district proposing, or thoughts for how the district might propose to address some of the affordable housing needs. So
sure, I can start.
Do you want to start? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So there's lots of data, historical and even more current, that suggests that as you subdivide land, it becomes less viable for farming. That's just sort of the way it goes across the board, no matter what the community is in British Columbia. It becomes more expensive on a per acre basis, and it tends to sort of get over time more towards the use in terms of rural residential rather than agricultural. And I didn't run the numbers, but that 2018 agricultural land use inventory looks exactly at that. So it looks at, remember when I said there was 60% of the ALR was being used for farming, it breaks it down into sort of parcel size. And typically what you see is that there's this sort of bell-shaped curve. So the very small parcels are barely used for farming, and then there's this kind of sweet spot around 4 to 10 hectares, and then it drops off again, and then it kind of pipes up again if you get really nice big pieces as well. So that tends to be the way it works. I know that people like to argue that if you subdivide land, it's going to be cheaper for people who want to get into farming, but that doesn't tend to be how it actually plays out on the ground. And so minimum lot sizes are really important. And I saw in the previous OCP that there was a drive towards higher minimum lot sizes. I think it was 20 hectares, which is great. So that's definitely the way to go. And then I'll just kind of pivot and talk just for a second about housing, because it seems to come up in the questions a lot about how do we house workers and also protect farmland. So I'm not sure if the question is about farm workers necessarily, but I'll take it in that perspective. There are, again, another complicated topic where there's federal, provincial, and local government regulations, but there's lots of guidelines and regulations regarding temporary farm worker housing, as well as permanent farm worker housing. So those are two different types of farm workers. They need to pass through various levels of permitting. But basically, if you can get through the federal permitting, then it goes down to local government, and then it goes to the land commission. So there's ways to do it that are fairly low impact. And some of the temporary farm worker housing are on non-permanent foundations, so that if the type of agricultural activity were to change and those workers were no longer required, then the housing could be removed. And the land commission often requires covenants to that effect and allows the housing in a sense that it's non-transferable. And if the property is sold or the use changes, that housing needs to be removed. So it can be done. The province has made great strides, I think, in terms of clamping down on the residential use of agricultural land, but local governments still do have a role to play, an important one as well.
Thank you. So would anyone like to take the question on how the district can address affordable housing, potentially through the infill intensification work that's been going on? And Edward, there's also a question about kind of industrial or general workforce housing, and how that might be able to be integrated into or adjacent to employment areas. So Jarrett, comments on affordable housing maybe first?
Sure, perhaps I can do that. So with the residential infill densification project, we looked at how we can, part of it was increasing our rental stock through, suites we already permit, but cottages and carriage houses in the community. So that does two things. It does provide rental housing, be it market rental housing, but it also allows people looking for homes to have a mortgage helper, for example. Many existing homes in our community cannot accommodate a suite just because they're built already and they're not designed that way. So potentially allowing a cottage in the backyard it is an option. Now, I'll point out that's not approved yet. It's approved in policy, but in zoning, that's what's being considered on April 20th at that public hearing. Around the affordable housing, so there's a existing policy in our official community plan that talks about trying to achieve 10% of new development to have affordable housing. So that would be housing that's managed by either a nonprofit society, for example, and is secured as affordable housing. So those are a few of the aspects, but also just allowing that densification to occur within our village centers, right in our core. So where you see up to 4 or 5-story apartments, it provides that range on the spectrum of different forms of housing to help with affordability. So, and then there's working with housing partners as well. There's many in Greater Victoria that provide that affordable housing, and working with them to establish their projects has been a number developed in the community over the years. So, and it's also our private developers. When we have development come forward, we do speak with them. Can you try to secure some rental housing or some affordable housing in your project directly? So you get that mix of housing even within a building.
Yep. Great. Thank you, Jarrett. Edward, did you want to add anything in there? Or?
Sure. I mean, just on the question around residential intensification or sort of a mixed use approach to some of the industrial lands around employment housing, I think that is an option, and there's some really good examples of that. Working in places that, depending on what the industrial uses are, and obvious compatibility there, and how the edges are treated. I would also say that in our experience, more of the mixed use conditions along corridors and retail, commercial, and residential mixed use, we've seen a trend away from that as such a simple solution, particularly in areas where you're trying to preserve affordability and affordable lease rates and things in retail environments. So specifically what I'm speaking to is, by mixing uses, the residential market component of mixed use starts to drive up land values to the point that the retail operators or the retail leaseholders can't afford those lease rates anymore. And so as a planning firm, we've actually started to walk back a little bit from a typical approach towards applying mixed use along retail corridors to saying, let's maintain retail commercial uses on a high street or a main street, and let's bring intensification of residential uses just off of that main street to support that main street, but not to drive the land values within the specific retail environment. So I would imagine that that's a similar concern and something we want to be very sensitive to in terms of the industrial lands and affordability of those industrial lands. My sense is there may be areas immediately adjacent to or very near to the Keating industrial area that might be an opportune location for residential intensification with an eye towards affordable housing and supporting workforce housing for the industrial area.
Great, thank you, Edward. A couple of great questions from Kristen. One is around, she's saying, I'm wondering how the Saanich people have been engaged in these conversations. Our municipality should be proceeding in a way that aligns with UNDRIP. Jarrett, are you able to talk about the engagement with Saanich?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rob. So we're in discussions and collaborating, working with the Saanich Leadership Council. We've had several meetings. What is such a unique opportunity here is the collaboration between Central Saanich, Sydney, and North Saanich, as we're all doing our OCPs together. But then having that dialogue and communication with our local First Nations through the Saanich Leadership Council. So we've had ongoing meetings, and we've extended those meetings. We're hearing some amazing input, and I think it's going to help shape some of our official community plan as we go forward with policies that we haven't thought of or even envisioned as we started this process. So it's really going to feed in some interesting comments about environmental protection, agriculture, cultural aspects that we are hearing and learning about. So it's been a really enjoyable opportunity, and it's great that that's continuing.
Great, thanks, Jarrett. And another good one from Kristen is saying, thanks everyone for your hard work and presentations. A lot of these issues seem to be a bit divisive, and that's understandable. That said, there are lots of topics that can bring our community together, including new recreational and community facilities where community members can come together and enjoy our beautiful municipality. Will the OCP consider these? In other words, when do we talk about the fun stuff? So Jarrett, maybe starting with you, and then if other panelists want to talk about, and maybe Mike on recreation and yeah, some of these parks and.
Yeah, excellent. So one thing we've identified as parks. It's such a large issue, and so the OCP is going to touch on that. Parks, recreation, it's a topic area that we'll cover. But one thing we've identified coming out of this OCP, and it was even identified prior to getting into this, is undertaking a parks master plan process. So it would include parks and recreation trails. So through this engagement, it's going to help us develop the work plan as we enter into that project. But I would envision that starting sometime in 2022 and into 2023. So it'll take a very detailed look at our parks needs, what infrastructure improvements we want to make in parks as we move forward. We have in Central Saanich an amazing parks infrastructure and our trails, our beaches. It's an incredible community we live in. So it's something that we're going to really focus on specifically. So I think it's too broad for this OCP review to dive into that detail.
Okay. Did anyone else want to talk to that one? Looks like Mike's going to.
I had one thought on that actually about just about natural area parks anyways, and integrating natural area parks into the urban environment. I think there's a lot of really interesting information about people's health and well-being as it relates to being in nature, being within close proximity to natural areas so they can walk over, experience wildlife. So integrating natural areas, even small little bits of natural areas into our urban environment or close to it is very important, I think, for the health and well-being of the community. And I know during COVID, there's been a lot of really interesting studies about the use of natural areas. People are using their local parks because they can't go places, and there's been tremendous, very positive feedback about local parks and local natural areas and having those available to our urban areas.
Yeah. Great. So, Jessica, so there were some questions that are, I think, questioning the climate emergency. Is this real? Do we have to do anything about it? Why does it make sense to do anything about the climate emergency? Give us some perspective, if you would, about what is the evidence that we're seeing kind of real impacts of climate change, and why is it important for us to do something about it as part of an OCP?
Yeah, I guess I would just, when I was seeing those questions come in, I would take the experience of Surrey, city of Surrey, who I have colleagues there that have been working on their climate adaptation strategy for many years. And I think, there's real lived experience of people in BC, in Southwest BC of dealing with sea level rise. And so in an area like Surrey, so you need to look, sea level rise is obviously a global phenomenon. You need to look at more provincial, regional trends to look at how sea level, so there is a trend to call it sea level change or sea change, because it's not rising and falling uniformly across the globe. But taking it to the ground level in Surrey is in areas like Surrey, Delta, places where we have these low-lying lands, where you're not only dealing with sea level rise, you're dealing with subsidence or subsidence. So sea level rise is impacted by the trend of subsidence and uplift. And again, I don't have the subsidence and uplift map in front of me for the Saanich Peninsula, but that's that CRD inundation mapping. There was an image in my PowerPoint in relation to that. So I think that's a starting place. But in Surrey, there's areas where, very minor levels of sea level rise have a huge impact. And there's millions and billions of dollars of assets in these areas that are low-lying. And it doesn't take much sea level rise to start having impacts on these millions and billions of dollars of assets. And they experience impacts from sea level rise already. So on high tide and stormy days, they're already seeing impacts to their built environment there. So it's a very real and pressing challenge for communities that have low-lying lands in Southwest BC. So I don't know if that addresses your question, Rob.
Well, that's good. Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that's somewhat related to some of the ones that have been on the board here, and that's around the role of agriculture and natural areas, forests in climate mitigation and sequestration. So some of you might have seen the movie Kiss the Ground on Netflix. It talks about agricultural lands as kind of a huge potential way to address climate change by sequestering carbon. What do you think, Ione? Is agriculture land, do we have an opportunity to do something in this community?
It would be so nice if agricultural land was the panacea solution for carbon sequestration problems that urban centers have created. No, I don't think I can say that with certainty. I mean, the science is tricky. Agricultural activities are diverse. When you say agriculture, I mean, that in and of itself is about 100 different potential things, right? So if you're talking about very low intensity grazing on grasslands, sure, maybe. But if we're talking about more intensive use of farmland for greenhouse production, then there's a whole bunch of inputs and outputs of carbon going in and out of a farm system. So this is an interesting point right now, where it seems like the politics and the funding are almost ahead of the science. I think the science is catching up, and I think the science is gaining ground, but there's a lot of math to be done. There's some great leaders, I would say, in British Columbia in this area. Sean Smuckler from UBC is one of them. And so the work is underway, but I think it's going to have to be a really nuanced approach to looking at those calculations. And I think it deserves to be nuanced because it is fairly complicated. And if we're starting to talk about the math, then it's going to be really, I think, I don't think it's a good idea to do these broad brushed kind of ideas around what farmland can and can't do with regards to carbon sequestration. But, certainly moving towards healthier soil ecosystems, regenerative practices, riparian habitat restoration, those are all good things. They're all moving in the right direction. But to say, blanket statements that, farming is better than this other type of use for carbon sequestration is hard, I think.
Okay, so Mike, so if agricultural land can't save us, can forested land?
Well, we know that trees absorb carbon. Younger, healthier trees, faster growing trees absorb more carbon. So yes, growing the urban canopy will help to fight against carbon or climate change. I think urban forests also, they provide the benefits of cooling and shading, so that the heat and sort of the heat island effect that occurs in our summer months. I think I agree with Ernie. There's stats and metrics about how much carbon is absorbed by trees and forests, but that changes so much with the type of species and how fast they're growing. Yeah, so but in general, I think we know for sure that more trees are better. So I'm a big proponent for, for a healthy and large urban forest.
Great, thank you. Maybe a follow-up one for you, Mike, here. And I see we've got about 10 minutes left. Lots of conversations about human corridors. Have wildlife corridors been identified in central Saanich? Is there a corridor that crosses the peninsula from Todd Inlet through Gregg Avenue, Gore, Nature Park, Oakhaven, Kersey Road, Hydro right-of-way, where it runs into the Pat Bay Highway? So I guess maybe a more general question for you, Mike. Tell us about wildlife corridors, the benefit of them, and what they need to work properly.
Yes, we're doing a bunch of work on that with Metro Vancouver and a bunch of cities in the Lower Mainland. As densification occurs, I think there's a realization that we need to protect wildlife and biodiversity. We need these larger hubs, habitat hubs, diverse ones. Ones that have wetlands, ones that have streams, that have forests. Old field habitat, but you can get genetic islands in these hubs for different populations if they can't expand and move to other areas and make use of other habitat areas. So I mentioned that a term that's being used quite often now is a green infrastructure network, and it's just that. It's a series of larger habitat hubs that are recognized, such as the provincial parks, and then some corridors that are protected to ensure species can move between them. And it's interesting, this changes, the type of corridor changes for birds, for mammals, for small mammals. Some of them need wider corridors, some of them can make use of smaller corridors. That's one of the benefits, again, when looking at the riparian policy in streams, is having wider riparian corridors have the additional benefit of providing corridors to our urban areas where wildlife can travel back and forth. So we haven't looked specifically at the movement corridors in central Saanich, but I think it's an excellent exercise. And one of the things that I think can be done now with mapping, LiDAR, ortho imagery, is more detailed mapping of these natural areas and their values.
Great, thank you. Jarrett, this might be a couple of related questions for you. One person came in late and said, why do we need additional density at all in central Saanich? And another related one is, why does central Saanich have to solve the region's affordable housing needs? Langford's already done that, hasn't it? Just perspectives on the need for affordable housing and any kind of additional density in the community.
Yeah, sure. So I think when we were undertaking the residential infill densification, as I said previously, it wasn't about how do we grow more and accommodate more growth or attract more growth. That's not what it was about. It was how do we accommodate our existing growth. So Central Saanich has seen about a 1% growth rate over the last 10 plus years, and that's anticipated to continue around that steady growth rate. So the new housing, it's around 70 to 100 units per year is what that approximately is. So we are seeing growth. So it's within our urban containment boundary. How do we accommodate that growth? Where are future children going to live? Where are families going to be raised? For example, housing costs are increasing so much, and if we just stopped housing, what would happen to the housing prices that are of those current homes? They would obviously go up because the demand is going to continue, but the supply is decreased. So it's something that housing is going to continue. It always has continued, and so it's not attracting more, it's accommodating what we're anticipating and managing that appropriately to maintain the character of our community and achieve walkable, healthy communities.
Great, thank you. Tim, this might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but when you think about smaller communities like Central Saanich, are there kind of standout examples that have really managed to make great progress on active transportation and really shift their mode share towards active transportation? Can we look to any communities as kind of great examples?
If I think of think of it in the sort of the CRD context, just to make it local, Esquimalt and Oak Bay both stand out as communities that are obviously much more urban than Central Saanich, I will say that, and definitely more compact. But I think some of the lessons there is that, especially in the Esquimalt context, is that you have a lot of new housing developments, multifamily and density, being located or put in areas that are already pretty walkable. So, I mean, that's just one example. I mean, Sydney, of course, community or neighbor in the peninsula. Sydney is fantastic. It does have very high rates of walkability, largely because, again, of its sort of compact form, and Sydney has over the years has improved its walkability, and I think it recognizes that when you have that compact community, how do you maximize investments in sidewalk infrastructure and active transportation infrastructure to make it very easy for people to get around on foot. So we're not talking about cycling at all. We're just talking about walkability. So just a few examples there with Sydney, Oak Bay, and Esquimalt as examples where walkability and active transportation are only getting better.
Great, thanks, Tim. Just looking at the time here. Okay, we've maybe got time for one more question and then we'll close it up. So I think there was a question about, integrated stormwater management. A few years ago, the district had an integrated stormwater management plan that talked about reducing pervious cover. Maybe Jarrett, you could comment on how the OCP might address stormwater management, flooding through integrated stormwater management, and maybe Mike could comment on that as well.
Sure, I can certainly start. So we do have a stormwater management bylaw, a stormwater management plan in place. And so it is something that I think we do need to look at as we go forward, as we're experiencing more densification. So we developed our policies around urban densification and whatnot. So we need to then bring in other policies around or bylaws around stormwater management, parking on streets, frontage improvements, all of those sorts of things. But how the OCP, I think, can help that is through these discussions, identifying issues, using our experts on the project to help us develop policies, and looking at best practices elsewhere of what we can do as we move through the OCP and then future projects to improve our stormwater management in the community.
Great. Edward, maybe some comments on the value and approach to treating urban stormwater in urban areas.
Yeah, sure. I mean, going back to that transect diagram and just sort of understanding that as a framework, I actually did quite a bit of work with Mike and Diamond Head in developing a transect for green infrastructure in the region and looking at kind of even more specifically urban forest management opportunities for to address climate adaptation throughout Metro Vancouver and mapping that against sort of a transect graphic. So, those opportunities, whether it's connected to urban forest growth and soil volumes to accommodate storm infiltration, those things are all linked together. So I think, again, understanding the diversity of landscapes that exist within Central Saanich and seeing that approach, the integrated stormwater management approach, inform all the development moving forward, from rural to the most urban is definitely the best way to win that.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, well, we've come to the end of our time. As I mentioned, we will try and address any questions we didn't get to tonight. I tried to group them together as much as possible so we could cover a lot of territory there. But yeah, thanks everybody for the great questions, and thanks to panelists for the answers. I'm going to turn it over to Jarrett to wrap us up.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'll just go through a few next steps and where this project is going. So as I mentioned earlier, we did show this slide previously, and it's basically showing the 4 phases of our official community plan review. So I won't go into great depths here, but we did go through the first phase where we did our background research, and we're currently in the second phase of the OCP. We're exploring current OCP opportunities and hearing from the community about our strengths and weaknesses of our OCP and where the community wants to go in the future. Phase 3 will be really starting summer and into the fall is once we gather all this feedback from the community, we'll be getting to draft our policy directions and our objectives for the OCP. So that's where we'll really be putting some pen to paper, and our experts that you've met tonight will be working on some policy options for the community. As part of that phase, there'll also be another opportunity for the community to weigh in and provide their input. And then, in phase 4, as I mentioned earlier, that is more the OCP formal process where council would reviewing and adopt the OCP through a legislative process that's required under the Local Government Act. So in terms of engagement activities and opportunities for engagement, here's a reminder that there are 3 engagement opportunities currently open until April 12th. So a few weeks yet still on that. So please visit our Let's Talk centralsaanich.ca/OCP website to find out more about how you can share your thoughts with us. We want to hear from as many people in the community as we can, as possible. So please help us spread the word about the OCP project with your family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances, and anyone that you speak with in the coffee shop, for example. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And I'd also like to thank our panelists and the consulting team for helping us organize this event this evening. We will be posting this recording from this evening on our website in the coming days. And I appreciate everyone's spending the evening with us tonight. Thank you and have a good evening.